to the beginning of our afternoon. We have two panels and a group of youth that we're still going to hear from yet today. And the first panel, I have the privilege of moderating and facilitating, and in just a moment I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves. Our original moderator, Dr. Catherine Hill, wasn't able to be with us today at a last minute, had a family emergency to deal with. And so we certainly miss her and her expertise in this area. Hey, Nikki. But it really is actually something very near and dear to my heart, and so I'm really happy to be able to step in for Catherine. My area of research at the university, separate from some of my more traditional child welfare training research, really focuses on the intersection between disability and child welfare. So I've been looking at the issues of collaboration, intersection, and the gaps for the better part of about 20 years now, with a specific focus on parenting with disability and how that works and doesn't work in receiving services through child welfare. So I'm going to bring that lens to the panel today and be able to hopefully add to the conversation as well as our very experienced panelists. So I'm going to have, hey, how are you? All right, so I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves. We'll start at the end and come back and just give, a couple minute introduction about who you are and where you work, what your experience is.
Okay, I turned it on right. Hi, everybody. I'm Shar McDonald, and I currently actually work at the Minnesota Department of Health. I do continuous quality improvement work for family home visiting, but that's a new gig for me. So I have about 20 years experience working in the child welfare field, starting out as a guardian ad litem, a child protection worker. I did on-call, I did family group decision-making, I did therapy with foster kids, and I'm a part-time therapist currently right now. I have a lot of education in early childhood, and in my various roles have had the opportunity to sit on interagency coordinating council for special education, the governor's task force. I've sat on the developmental screening task force, and so I've been part of a lot of interagency collaborations related to early childhood and disability.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Megan Westerheide. I currently work for Dakota County. I'm an embedded social worker in a police department. And I also have a crisis stabilization caseload, which looks a little bit different in Dakota than it looks in other counties. But I focus primarily on individuals, youth and adolescents with significant mental health symptoms that result in physical aggression, verbal aggression, and everything that comes along with that. My background is in corporate foster cares for adolescents, very similar adolescents that we worked with. From there, I worked in federal setting for schools as a school social worker. I realize that not everyone knows what federal setting fors are, so just a quick explanation. It's for individuals who are not best supported in their mainstream schools. So separate buildings with students all on individualized education programs, with a span of different disabilities. So a lot of work specifically with individuals who are in those federal setting for schools. And I also worked in emergency rooms as a mental health clinician doing all the assessments. Just the easy stuff.
Hello, my name is Hannah Checkett. I am a lead social worker in the initial intervention unit in St. Louis County. Prior to my position as a lead social worker, I've worked the last 10 years as a county child welfare worker in a variety of positions, including ongoing child protection, investigation, assessment, juvenile probation, and then in the last few years exclusively corporate child foster care and family 245D licensing and development. I guess that's it.
My name is Gail Koop, and I'm from St. Louis County. I started out in this field totally pretty much accidentally. I'm an RN. I worked in the newborn intensive care unit, and this is back in the 80s when kids would go home with much more fragile conditions than we see them going home today just because of improvements in medical care. But infants with tracheostomies, feeding tubes, preterm with not so great outcomes. And I said, I could do this. I could take this baby home. And so I got licensed and I did that. And I did family foster care then for many years, decreasing my workload at St. Mary's Hospital in Duluth and increasing my foster care responsibilities. I loved it. One day, wasn't Hannah, but I've worked closely with Hannah for many years. St. Louis County said, well, you do such a good job with this. How about if you think about opening a corporate home? Write us up a proposal of what you could do. And I was totally inexperienced with this concept, but the target population was developmentally disabled girls. And I thought, this is what I know, so why not? So I did that and it went really well. And then they asked me, well, that's going really well. Would you consider opening a second home? And I said, well, this one's going so good. Why wouldn't I? And yeah, then they give me 2 teenage boys with mental illness. And I'm going, yeah, who knows very much about teenage boys with mental illness. But I've grown to have 4 homes, 17 beds. Some days are tougher than others. And but I love what I do.
Why? Is it mine? You got it. Okay. Hi, my name is Nikki Villavicencio. I use she, her, sha pronouns. I am the chair of the Minnesota Council on Disability. I also happen to be a Maplewood City Council member, but most importantly, I'm a mom of an 11-year-old. And yes, she is 11 now, so it makes me feel old. But that's kind of how I got into this space. I was first a disability rights activist, and then becoming a mother, I just realized, oh my gosh, there is no services for parents with disabilities. And so my partner and I and several other advocates worked really hard to make a first of its kind in the country, a preventative legislation in Minnesota for supports for parents with disabilities. And we worked with Tracy and her department on research, and we've also done through nonprofit work one-on-one support for with other parents with disabilities, and going through the journey just as a mom and advocating on behalf of my other roles as chair of the Council on Disability. So.
Thank you, everyone. Did I tell you? It's a great panel. Okay. So thinking about collaboration and already in your introductions, being able to identify that there's a number of intersections that you have with a number of different fields. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about, I'm going to go right into the deep stuff. What is it that you think needs to happen in terms of collaboration, specifically with child welfare, all of the fields though, not just the child welfare folks, but what needs to happen in terms of collaboration that doesn't currently happen?
I liked what I think it was Amelia from earlier. The panelists talked about releases of information and communication. We're often very siloed in our different divisions, and whether that's in education, within the county, group homes, and I think the big piece is communication. We often get stuck. I loved the term turfing because I see it often. And we're operating in these different silos where we're not communicating with one another. So we each have information, but it's not overlapping. And so we're not seeing the holistic picture, and which is not supporting our families and our children in the best way possible. And so I think that was something that was really big for me as a school social worker and I realized the privilege, and I had 50 students on my caseload and not 350, but especially with our students who had really extensive needs, I was able to connect with therapists, with case managers, with child protection workers, and when we all can come to the table and we can talk firstly about the strengths of our families and really dig into what's really going well and what are the barriers and how can we support this family from a strengths-based approach, we just see much better outcomes. And so I think I loved when you talked about the releases of information, because those are so important, and we can get really stuck in just operating within our own teams, but our team should be anybody who's involved with the family so we can come to the table to have the best outcome for our families.
I neglected to say that I worked at JHS for 5 years. I don't know if I blocked that from my memory. So sorry, colleagues of mine that are actually here today. But I coordinated all the efforts for the PSAP program for the last 5 years before my time at MDH. And as part of my job there, I had the privilege of doing some focus groups with child protection and early intervention Part C folks to ask the same questions about like systems. What do you know about child protection? What do you guys know about early intervention? And nobody knows anything about each other. That's the problem. Like, child protection workers, we didn't know that early intervention has 45 days to do that whole evaluation. That's important information, right? Child protection or early intervention staff don't know that child protection, when they're mandated to do a Help Me Grow referral, when they're not. And there's a big disconnect on how they communicate what that service is for these kids and families. Yeah, it works. You can hear me? What? No?
To echo that sentiment, coming into this profession as a child welfare worker, child protection worker. Hello? Oh, much better. To echo that, coming into this profession as a child protection worker or child welfare worker, there's this pressure that I'm sure we all have felt at different points to kind of be a jack of all trades and a master of none. We work so often in so many different domains and different areas in supporting our families, whether it's chemical health, mental health, early intervention, our school systems, our community partners, our law enforcement partners. There's just so many moving pieces to the work that we do. And if we do it well, we're just constantly making those connections. And I was about 5 years into my career and working in child protection before I had the opportunity to transition into licensing, which I thought would be a very different type of responsibility and role, and it was. But once I got into licensing and started to interact more intimately with my adult service partners, home and community-based services, disability services, and Rule 185, there was a world that opened up that I had been unaware of prior. And I looked back at so many opportunities that had been missed with the families I worked with in crisis, where I could have built capacity and protection and safety by leaning into the experts and the voluntary services, even available within our own agencies. And I think for me, that's a big barrier, and a thing that's missing is that when we bring in new child welfare workers, we really have to provide them with a good education as to what we as agencies have to offer the families we serve, as well as what our community partners can offer the families we work with.
A barrier that I'm experiencing right now as a foster care provider is the education system. They're struggling for staff too, and the classes are too big, and the special needs classes don't have enough paras, and open enrollment children can be refused service if they're an open enrollment. St. Louis County is a big county, and this particular child might live on the range but need to attend school in Duluth, and the ISD 709 can say, we just don't have the capacity to serve that kid. I feel like it's not that they're saying, well, we don't want to, we just don't have it. We don't have paras, we don't have enough classroom, we don't have enough special ed teachers, we don't have the resources, and so I'm sorry, we can't service your kid. And so now I have a kid that has no place to go to school, which puts an increased burden then on me, and it's just not right for the kid. So finding enough academic people to support this kid for their time away from my foster care program has been a real challenge.
Well, I couldn't agree more about the silos having to be broken down in all of our systems. As a disability rights activist, and obviously as a mother, that has been the biggest barriers that I've faced. And obviously, the thing that I think of is most of you probably know that the school system is a lot of times the first time where in a situation such as myself, where the parents are physically disabled, the school is the first intervention in a lot of families. And so understanding that an IEP may be needed for a student, but there are also accommodations that have to be done for the parents. And most school systems are not even aware or, and many times, not in my situation, because my partner and I are fairly established advocates. We don't take no for an answer very well. We get pretty far, but I know of many, many other people that when trying to advocate in the school system for their own accommodations as parents with disabilities, they are just denied.
I think that's a really good point, Nikki, in terms of how are we meeting the needs of a variety of people within the family unit. And part of it is, do we even know? So one of the things that I think about that research shows and that I think practice wisdom tells us is that, centering child welfare for a second, if you are a child welfare professional, if you have a caseload or you're a supervisor, it is impossible for you to not be working with people with disabilities, whether they're kids or parents. It is absolutely impossible. And yet, depending on where you're coming from education-wise, schools of social work and other human service degreed programs don't require you to take any classes or give you any kind of specialized training around working with, advocating alongside, and serving people with disabilities. So then I think what Hannah was talking about, so we have new child welfare workers and we expect them to be experts in substance abuse, experts in maltreatment, experts in domestic violence, expert in educate, like it's not possible, right? We need time and we need to develop skills. And more than that, we need to have resources and relationships in order to be able to get the services that kids and families need. Because I can't help myself. Data. So, I mean, do you know that many studies, not just in Minnesota, but more than 50% of kids who are in foster care have an IEP or a disability label and diagnosis? More than 50%, but we're not requiring or providing training. So how does the child welfare worker know to advocate, or who do they go to help when there's an IEP meeting? Does the foster parent go? Do I go? Does the parent get to go? How do we coordinate all that? Where's our model for that? My argument would be everybody kind of recreates and makes it up as they go, and some kids get their needs met and many, many don't, right? Parents with disabilities. We know that parents with disabilities are are disproportionately represented in child welfare. Parents who have an intellectual disability can be up to 3 times more likely to have their kids have a termination of parental rights. Some studies say that 40 to 50% of parents who have an intellectual disability lose custody of their kids at some point in time. Can all parents with disabilities parent? No. Just like all parents who don't have a disability can't always parent, and we might need some intervention. But we shouldn't be making decisions just at the flush of having a disability. That was a long piece, like you think I'm on the panel. I'm not. Okay. All of that to give context to say, you all talked about the need for collaboration, the need to kind of get through silos, and yet our funding streams and our systems are incredibly rooted in silos. So what are the strategies you take to get across those silos, to make the relationships? We've heard all day, it's all about relationships. How do you go about making those relationships so that they're sustainable? Anybody?
I talk a lot and I can be pretty obnoxious. So I try to bring that into my work. In that I will reach across, I want to work with individuals in different units. So I apologize a lot of the time because my emails are really long, or I might call a lot of times. But I think it's really putting in the time and to get those contacts and to ask those questions of who's not at this table right now and how do we bring those people to this table. And also talking with the family about who's important to you. And not just in the formal systems, but who's important to your family. Is it an auntie? Is it an uncle? Is it somebody who lives next door? How do we bring these people in? And I think really talking about what I can and can't do within my own job, what I'm able to do, what capacity I have, but also what are they able to do, and then how do we share that workload? Sharing the power was talked about earlier. And I think really being able to look at, because not everybody is an expert in every area, and I don't think anybody is an expert in any area. So how do we figure out who we can talk to about that has the knowledge of these systems or this specific thing, whether it's an IEP, whether it's a parent with an accommodation, and how do we talk about what people best need while also checking ourselves, because it's not about me as a professional and you doubting my ability to do something. So how do I take a backseat with my own ego to best provide the support that our families need?
I think one thing I've noticed over time is that willingness to listen when you are at the table, and being a team player and not hogging the knowledge, if you will, or being the boss of a meeting, but really being able to listen to what someone else brings to the table, because we can't know it all. And I find at the next meeting, when I meet up with someone again, they've perhaps remembered me as somebody they can work with, or somebody that they enjoy working with, or somebody that maybe they learned something from me, something that I had shared. So that ability to bring all of the people who do come to the table, who you get to the table, that you work well together, listen to each other. We have to affirm each other as caregivers, or we're drowning too. So just that, bring it to the table and work together, listen to each other, support each other, teach each other, take criticism. Sometimes you need it. Sometimes you maybe didn't understand something, ask for clarification, but just those inner dynamics when you are sitting at the table to build a stronger team is really important.
I also think it's about centering why we're there at that table, and that we all have the common goal. Like running family group decision makings and case planning conferences, that's the first thing that we do, is we think about, this is the kid or the kids, here's their pictures, what do they need, and why are we all here? I can tell you, we had a case a long time ago when I was working at a county, and I was doing therapy with them in their foster home. They were little guys, and we had they had so many services for disabilities. They had nursing, they had early childhood special ed in the home, they had so many doctor's appointments, they had they were behind developmentally a lot, and like physically maltreated, like nutritiously maltreated, and we had case planning conferences, I don't know, I probably think almost every month with all of the professionals, because they had visits and people coming in their home 5 times a day to check on their weight checks and do all of these things. And that would have not, that's a success story in itself, because those boys are, I still have a relationship with them, and they are, you know, they need support and they have some ongoing disabilities, but they are thriving because we came together, all of our systems across education, the medical field, child protection, therapy.
Shar, how can you help people understand, how did that happen?
Well, we had an amazing foster parent involved with those boys. And Julie, who was on the first panel today, did supervised visits for mom. And so we started like recognizing that these kids had so many needs. And so we were like, how can we all communicate together? And foster parent was like, well, I have to do this, and then we have to put in visits, and how do we? And so we just were like, we should all be at the same table. And the county I worked in was very progressive in family group decision-making type meetings. And so that was kind of where that was born. And then once we recognized that, like, when you list, here's are the needs of these kids, I mean, it's like flabbergasting when you just think about how holy, like, these little guys are 2 and 3. I mean, we gotta figure out how to work together for them. And those, I mean, it's such an amazing collaboration, because we even had foster mom was in every single visit with birth mom, and parent educator, supervised visitor, Julie, because those kids needed her to be there for their attachment needs, right? And so luckily, myself and Julie were actually in an infant early childhood mental health certificate program at the time of this case. And so it was like forefront in our mind, the importance of that for those little guys. And it really, truly is a success story.
And I'll say that I'll not be shy and say I am an expert. As a disability rights activist, I teach advocates all over the state that they are the expert of their own lives. And I'll tell you why we do that so passionately. It's because a lot of times we're not believed. We feel that we're not believed, and we're not believed by the history of disability services. They're racist and sexist and ableist. And that's why those silos and the barriers exist. And as far as collaboration, the best way I've collaborated is I am the expert in my world, and I find people like Tracy who are experts in their world, and combine those, like just to use the experience that I had with you, is she was able to give us data about people with IEPs in the state of Minnesota, and then we were able to take that to the state legislature. And those types of numbers are things that people can't deny, right? Like, you can sit here and say all the things that you feel and think and know and experience, but when you see the numbers, they're black and white. And so when you have that collaboration with the facts, and then people who are passionate about pushing an issue, that's what has been very successful in my experience.
One more thing to say to that. It really starts with you all in this room. You know, she asked, how did that happen? It was because somebody cared enough to figure out, like, we needed to work together as a whole collective bodies of systems, and not just individually.
I have found that many pediatrician offices or family practice have care coordinators, and that's been a good place to start for many of my kids, bringing people to the same table. And I've had good experience with that as a way to get into a lot of people sitting around the table.
As I hear you talk, and we've talked at the earlier panel about racism and bias and discrimination, clearly in the area of disability that is incredibly prevalent, just by the recognition that we don't even require any kind of disability training or education around disability advocacy or knowledge, shows that it's just our bias is that it's not important, it's not on our plate. And my experience is, as somebody who's done research, every time I go to present, I'll go to a national conference and present about disability and child welfare. And the people that come and sit in the audience are all from disability services. Hardly ever do child welfare people come because they see that title, you got all these things to pick from, and they're like, oh, I don't do disability. I'm betting many of you are like, I don't do disability. But you do, right? We already established there's no way you can't be doing that, providing services and working with parents. And so I think that it makes me think of universal design in some regard. I think that there are people who have learning differences, perhaps, as part of what their disability is, or it limits their engagement in things. But if you ask them a straight out question, or you try to look for a disability label or diagnosis, they may not have that. So that might not be the way we get at the information, right? We might need to get at the information in terms of how can we best serve you? How do you receive information best, right? People get dysregulated when they get overwhelmed. We have youth and adolescents with disabilities who are in foster care who get really dysregulated, and then we're wondering, like, well, why won't they participate? Why are they having all these behavior problems and they're in the 17th foster home? Are we centering accommodations and modifications? Probably not, because we don't know how. And so I think that what I'm hearing all the panelists say too is that there's an element of humility, being able to ask for help. I don't know how to serve this kid. Help me. Who do you ask? How do you get help? Where do you go? It's the act of doing. Like Shar said, it starts with all of us. From the first panel, we talked about, somebody asked a question about parenting assessments and kind of the damning nature of parenting assessments. So Nikki, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. I think about how prevalent parenting assessments are, especially parenting capacity, particularly with parents with a variety of kinds of disabilities. And often we come in with our bias. We all have bias, and we come at it and say, oh my gosh, how can she parent? She can't parent. My assumption is she can't parent. Or that poor kid. What is that? What's life like at that house? And when we do parenting assessments are not necessarily normed or developed with disability in mind, right? It's the bell curve. We've all learned that in school. It's all about the bell curve. And so we're using assessments, like we talked about before, in Indigenous communities that don't fit what's happening. It doesn't measure protective factors, right? It doesn't serve those parents and families. And the same thing happens with parents with disabilities all the time. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit in terms of how do you think child welfare professionals or other service providers can do a better job helping parents be able to demonstrate what they are capable of?
So the first example that I can think of is from my own experience when I first had my daughter, and you're in the hospital and you're offered the one time nurse coming out to your house and doing a home visit, and we said yes, and then we said, is there any way that we could make this more of a program regularly, more than just the one time visit? And luckily we were able to, but it was a journey. So the nurse that came out, she was a lovely woman, older, and obviously had never had experienced two folks with disabilities raising a child together in one household. And so she looked around our home and said, oh no, we got to do a lot of child proofing around here. What about this? There's all these knives on like 2 feet off the ground. What are we gonna do here? And we would go through the house, and I'd say, well, this knife I use, so I sit in a wheelchair. You can see me in a wheelchair, but at home I'm on the floor most of the time. And so my kitchen, we now have a accessible kitchen that the county waiver provided for us. But before that, it was very challenging to cook for me and my husband and my daughter. But anyways, we've always accommodated things for us to be able to do some of the cooking ourselves. And so there are a lot of times things that are dangerous for a child, but I need to have access to them too, because I'm on the floor. And so it took time and seeing through this nurse and our relationship on how, even though her first assessment was to see the dangers of all the things that were there, after she spent time with us, she saw by the end of the relationship with her, she was like, oh, you guys got this, you can do whatever, and we were like best friends at the end of the situation, which is awesome. And in the work that I've done with the legislation, assessments are a big part of it, because what we've seen in the research nationally is that if you can give just a small amount of services to people with disabilities, a lot of times you can prevent any child welfare interaction, because a lot of folks just need very easy things to put together. It's hard to explain, but it goes individual by individual. That's why it's not a cookie cutter thing. And that's why that nurse being with us for like a year was such an amazing experience.
Wondering if others can give, thinking about young kids with disabilities being served through child welfare, kids in foster care, older kids with disabilities. Can you think of a time where you felt like there was incredibly successful collaboration? Right, Shar already told us about one case, but are there other examples that you can share with the group in terms of when did it work and why did it work?
I think this is not quite on topic, so hopefully someone will get it back, but I would want to put a word in there for families who are choosing foster care because of their child's disability. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep my marriage together. I can't keep my other children safe. Her needs, his needs are beyond what my family can provide. And to embrace that knowledge that that family knows my family. They know what they can do. They know what their limit are. I have a number of kids with disabilities in voluntary foster care placement, and it's important to love that parent and family and siblings right along with the child you have, because they feel so inadequate and so judged for choosing foster care. And in many cases, that might be the best thing. And to be so careful of your words. I have a story, it's a terrible story. It was a mom who I dearly love and have been a friend now 20 years. She had a set of twins. The little girl was perfectly normal. The little boy had terrible, terrible hydrocephaly and wasn't going to live. And it was back in the days, her husband was a night GJ and she was a billing clerk at the local clinic. And she said, how can we do this? How can we take care of this kid? How can we take care of our other newborn? We have to have health insurance. And they chose foster care. And they felt very judged for not taking both of their children home. And the little boy lived 2.5 years with me, far longer than anyone ever expected, with a gigantic heavy head. And at one point, we finally had to decide he needs a feeding tube. We can't feed him. We're not going to do heroics to save his life, but we're not going to let him starve to death either. And he can't eat enough. And honest to God, the pediatrician, the peds intensivist, when they asked Mom, what do you want us to do if he arrests during the surgery? And the mom says, let him go. And the physician said to that mom while I was sitting there, parents who really love their children will do everything to help them survive. And that mom never recovered from that comment, ever. But love our moms and dads and parents and siblings of people who choose foster care is so important.
I think that's an excellent, excellent point for us to think about. And as we're collaborating, then how do we support that family to continue to be involved, right? Because they're not saying they don't want to be involved. Any other examples of successes that you'd like to share?
I think the times that I've found it the most positive is when I was humble enough to ask questions that I didn't understand. Like if I didn't know, we all know people look different, right? Not just disability, but like race, ethnicity, right? But if we don't understand something, we need to ask questions. And so I think asking questions of the parents who know their kiddos, who know what's worked for them. Like if you have a kiddo who comes into care I had a young man who only ate hot dogs and applesauce. That was his only food. And I was like appalled by that, right? Like you gotta feed your kid other stuff. Why? I don't know. I was just thinking that, right? Because that's how I was raised. But I had to work with that mom, help get that kiddo into some feeding therapy, kind of understand his needs. And that kiddo actually never went into care. Got to stay home with Mom, but I didn't understand that, but I had to ask.
I'm gonna open it up for questions in just a minute, but some of your comments have made me wonder. So if you're coming at it, or depending on where you're working, some are child welfare, some are in education, other areas, disability. If you could think about from your position where you work, or the position you come from, and child welfare being one of those, what would another critical collaborator, who would that be? Assuming family is already identified, like family, right? For sure. But if you think about, if you want people to start thinking about how do I build collaboration when my cases involve people with disabilities, who are the people? Who are the helpers?
It's hard to say one. I feel like the story that I told you about those little boys, it was medical, and educational, and then the CP world that really came together for those kids, foster parents. So it's hard to, I think if one of them was missing, we would have missed something.
Yeah, I think it's really individualized to the family and their needs, and really bringing in what best supports them. I love that you said ask questions, because I think working with several different cases where with a parent with a disability in an IEP, and it had, when we ask the question of how do you best like contact, because I've seen so many papers just get sent home and mailed to parents, and that maybe they don't have the capacity to write at that time, or maybe they don't have the capacity to read it, whatever it is. And so I loved that you said that. And so I think it really depends on the individual and the area of expertise. So like for education, is it going to be the school social worker that knows the IEP process? Or for medical, is it going to be the pediatrician? For case manager, is it mental health? You know the resources, and it really depends on the needs of the family and being able to dig in with the family on what they best need and what best supports them, because I truly believe that parents are the experts of their children. And I think that's really important for us to remember as social workers or whatever area we're working in. Just because I have a background in mental health does not mean that I understand your child better than you do. And I think that's something that's really, really important, is to remember our parents or guardians or caregivers, whoever, they are the experts on their children.
I think, for me, showing up and meeting a parent where they're at. Not only as a professional, we navigate these very difficult systems that are hard and challenging and complex. And then we're working with people in crisis, especially in child protection and child welfare, who have a slew of other things they're worried about. They have that case plan, that the cookie cutter thing, all the things they have to do. And then on top of it, they're supporting their child with disabilities and trying to navigate the systems and find the resources. And so oftentimes when we're working with those families, for me, the humility in our practice of, I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to make a point to find someone who does have the answers. I think, as a person with privilege who has an education, who's familiar with these systems, I'm also a parent to a child with autism. And so I'm always mindful in IEP meetings, for example, that I have the advantage of knowing systems and communicating with providers and having connections that the families we serve don't. So if we can stand in that space as child welfare workers and empower them and assure them that this is really hard, like parenting a child that may be different is really challenging, and keeping space for that is huge. It builds trust in that relationship. They know that you're here as an ally, as an advocate, and that at the end of the day, we have the same goal in mind. We want your child to be supported, to be safe, and for their well-being to be met.
And from my experience, obviously, I come from a very different perspective. So when I thought about this, I was more thinking in the lines of nonprofits, because a lot of times nonprofits are the ones that are kind of like on the ground, working with folks and know their needs the best. So, and when I mean that, I'm thinking in terms of like, whether it's people from different backgrounds and different communities, if you're serving different types of folks, and you're not familiar with that community, then going to a nonprofit that does deal with that community is probably, in my experience, is the best way to collaborate as well, and can be on there, because they're the ones a lot of times giving the direct service to that maybe the state doesn't do, or they get the grants from the state to do. And so, and the workers that work in the nonprofits, they really they know that community the best a lot of times.
We're going to open it up for questions, whether there's online or questions for any of the panelists. Over in the corner, Kate. Oh, here you want. All right.
Hi, my name is Dur, and if you can't see, imagine an Asian girl with medium long hair tied up in a half-do, and wearing cute overalls. But I guess my question to the panel is, so disability is still very much invisible still. And so I guess in a lot of social justice movements, typically to gain visibility, it's focused on the white middle class experience. And so oftentimes people of color or of different cultures have to acculturate in order to feel like they're seen in those communities that are moving forward. And so I guess my question is, how are you combating that in your positions, and or other colleagues that you've seen do that as well? Because I'm just curious, or what your opinions are on that. Thank you.
Can I just clarify? So is your question, I mean, I think you're drawing a parallel. So is your question that when people have less visible disabilities, more invisible disabilities, that they would feel compelled to have to fit into a framework of dominant culture or ability? And the question is then, how did these folks in their positions help serve those folks?
Sorry, just to make that clear.
No, it made sense. I just wanted to clarify.
Okay, I don't know if I can answer it the best, but it makes me think about again, back to asking questions to understand. And like, so on the developmental screening team, we do all like the ASQ, all those, like we make recommendations about that across Minnesota. And for all different disciplines. And one of the things that we're working on in that group is trying to because those screening tools are not validated for Indigenous people. And so we're working with Brooks Publishing to try to figure out that, but then there's like all these barriers to that. And so I think we're just trying really hard to push back so that we can have better validated screening tools cross-culturally. And this is in my role at the Department of Health. And then also, as you were talking, it was reminding me of just thinking about cultural differences in even development. There are, countries where families carry their young till they're 1, and then they don't walk, and we think that they're developmentally delayed because according to Western practices, they're not walking by the time they're 1, or they've skipped all of those other developmental milestones. And so it reminded me to think about that and just bring that to this space.
I also think that goes back to what I had said earlier about universal design. I think there's probably few intake or assessment protocols that ask about disability, number one. But if they do, because of invisible disabilities or societal pressures, somebody might not say, oh, yeah, I can't read. Not that that's a disability, but I have maybe this learning difficulty or what have you. So I think it's more about, I think we've done as a field a really good job of trying to look at the language we use in documents and how it is that we convey information to parents in written form, and it's still overwhelming. We know it's overwhelming, right? Super overwhelming. Well, but what if you had a receptive language challenge? Like you can't hear and process all at the same time. That first visit, are we going to walk away and be like, oh, they weren't even listening to me? They don't really care. They didn't show up at court. Well, you know what? Maybe they just didn't track that information. So perhaps asking questions, universal design, in your initial engagement with them, like, how do you best learn? How do you best receive information? What's the best way for me to communicate to you? And let them tell you, because then, right, there's some buy-in, there's some control, and their needs are being addressed. So I think that's one way that we can all do.
I also think, just to add on to that, kind of like when we think about our work with fathers and when we ask parents about fathers, and then we can't just ask it once, right? We have to ask it lots of times. So child protection workers are scary to families. So we're scary. So if we want to say, like, how do you best learn, or do you have any disabilities? do I want to tell you? You just took my kids away. I don't think I want to tell you today. But maybe, you know, in a couple weeks when you see me again and you ask me, I might feel a little bit more safer to be able to tell you. I think that's important to think about.
Other questions? I'm going to bring it right to you. I'm here. I don't need a runner. Oh, you go first. Okay, then we'll go.
Just a quick question out of curiosity, because I've worked with kids that have had high needs and stuff. The kids that you mentioned that are thriving, Shar, who did they end up with? Were they reunified or?
They were not reunified. They were adopted by their foster parents. And actually, I remember going out there because I ended up being their adoption worker in the end. And I remember going there and they sat me down and they said, Shar, I don't think we can do this. And I lost my crap. I cried with those people on their couch and was like, okay, because I was like, these boys have done so good. And they did end up with them. And actually at that adoption court hearing, Judge Hawley was their judge, and she said, you guys having some trepidation actually makes me feel more confident in your ability to support these kids long term. And I never really thought about that in the moment, but I just remember crying with those foster parents because I was like, oh man. And that mom, you know, she had a journey that she had a hard journey in her life. So not to say that she shouldn't have been able to reunify with her kids, but she had a long road ahead of her. So they do not. They do have contact with, they were Native American out of Turtle Mountain Tribe in Wisconsin through their birth dad, who he terminated his rights immediately upon any proceedings. So he had no relationship with them. And they didn't have any connection with their tribe, but we had ICWA involved. And so we were able to fortunately introduce them to that part of their identity.
Is this on? Oh, hi. Okay. I want to say thanks to everybody who's commented and asked questions. My name is Lucy. It's nice to meet all of you. I had a question because you can't tell, but my mom is from Mexico. And I have a sibling with an intellectual disability who also has children with intellectual disabilities. Sometimes when folks are encountering social service providers for the first times in their lives who are not from the United States, they don't really know what to expect or what to do or what you're doing. And a lot of times we have disabilities that we don't have words for or understand how to describe them. So just a quick question that you can answer in like 2 seconds. That was me joking. How do you go into conversations with people who may not know your language? And I'm not just talking about English. I mean like the social service, social worker, child welfare language that we all know. How do you go in to find out how to provide and support for that family and identify the holistic needs that family has? Now, you can answer that in like a second, I'm sure.
Well, I think, for me, it goes to the kind of the question the first person asked. And I was thinking in my mind that really what needs to happen is more folks who represent communities need also to be the workers as well, right? Like in my work, I'm constantly thinking, I can't help everybody, but I can focus in on the most marginalized people. And in my experience, the most transformative way to do that is to put the people who look like them, speak like them, and think like them, working with them. So.
I can say, kind of like Tracy said earlier, it's sort of about how you can ask the questions in a different way and not just say, do you have a disability, but what can I do that makes you be able to hear me better? What, how do you learn best? Like, because, we know people are visual learners or audio. We all know that as professionals. So just thinking about how we can delicately talk about that. I appreciate that question because it made me think.
I also like to I ask you a ton of questions. What questions do you have for me? Whether that's about me as a person or me as a professional. My role currently is also really confusing. So I'll say, like, what do you understand about this? People commonly, when you leave a social service card at their door, think you're child protection. And so there's also that too of not every social worker is a child protection worker. And so asking what they understand about what my role is and how I can help them better explain it, or I think really spending a lot of time with them too to build that relationship. And again, I'll say it's really, my position right now is really nice because I can spend that time, whereas I know that that's not the case for child protection workers who have 15 cases. But really learning one another to figure out, because the person may not even know themselves, like, what's the best way. And so learning together about these things and how does our relationship best work and best support you.
Join me in thanking our great panel.